Профессор, слово вам.
Спасибо. Is this now turned on? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Translators here? So, thank you very much. Спасибо to Новые, будущее Foundation, the Futures Foundation. I appreciate very, very much your translation of our book, and thank you to the School of Management School for organizing this event. I wanted to ask, get a sense of the audience for a few minutes. How many of you are students at this school in the room? If you could put your hand up. How many are students in the school? Okay. How many of you are faculty members in the school? Okay. How many of you are business people running businesses? That's great. And how many of you are nonprofit organizations, non-commercial? Very good. So it looks like a very mixed crowd, which is wonderful. This is the kind of crowd that needs to be brought together to hear this message. So I come to you today with a kind of good news message. It's a good news message with some risks attached to it and some uncertainties, as we've heard. But it's really a kind of interesting good news story. And fundamentally, the story, as I indicated when I made those first comments, is that we are in the midst around the world of an important revolution in social purpose finance, a revolution in social purpose finance, which is potentially able to give us an important leg up, an important boost on our effort to solve social and environmental problems around the world. And so I think it's very important. It is still embryonic. One way to introduce it is to tell you a story, and it's a story that came out of a newspaper, a little newsletter really, called Microfinance Africa. It ran a story in September of 2011. And this is a newsletter serving the microfinance industry in Africa. And it told about an unusual development designed to help East Africa cope with its skyrocketing food crisis. It turned out that an unexpected consortium had come together to channel $25 million to a series of small and medium-sized East Africa agricultural businesses that were in the business of getting food to the market faster and more efficiently with more protection than was available previously. And this was a consortium that involved the U.S. Agency for International Development. But it turned out that although this was a government agency that was a party to it, it was not your normal top-down government-funded development project. Rather, this U.S. Agency for International Development had teamed up with 3 foundations, with a U.S. investment firm, J.P. Morgan, and with a private Kampala-based investment company to channel this money into these small businesses. And what may be most unusual about this deal in the current climate of development assistance and general philanthropic action is that it's no longer unusual. It's an example of what people in the field have begun to thought seemingly contrary forces that can bring different forces together, producing new life forms and taking advantage of their interdependencies. So USAID managed to stimulate this investment of $25 million without spending one dime of its own money. And we refer to this with a word that I gather is not in the Russian language as leverage. How did they do this? They put up some technical assistance, but then they encouraged an investment fund to come together, and it was assembled by combining a U.S. Agency for International Development guarantee, like insurance, of an $8 million loan from J.P. Morgan, so the money is coming from this private investment company, and then they convinced 3 foundations to put up $17 million of equity finance. This is stock. This is not grants. It's not loans. It's equity, a different kind of investment. And so these foundations were functioning like what I've called philanthropic banks. They're no longer simply foundations. They are banks in the sense that they have multiple windows with multiple tools of assistance, but they are fundamentally using their charitable dollars. And so what is going on out there is that this kind of arrangement, this kind of mobilization of private investment capital, it turns out to be growing in importance. And it's this phenomenon that this book is really all about. So one way to think about it is that the world of philanthropy is being undergoing what I've referred to as a big bang. You've heard this term in physics. The creation of the universe came out of a big bang, an explosion that created our solar systems. Well, the world of philanthropy is undergoing a big bang. There's been an explosion of actors and tools all over the world. And they have very funny names. Willow Tree Investors. And what in the world could that be? Blue Orchard Investors. It's a Swiss social investment company. Company de Sao Paulo. This is a private foundation that came out of the privatization of banks in Italy. We have Avishkar International in India. It's a loan fund focused on small-scale agriculture in rural India. And so there's been this enormous explosion of actors and tools that has begun to fill this space that we refer to as philanthropy. And I use the term philanthropy in a very broad sense. I use it to refer to any mobilization of private investment capital, private resources for social or environmental purposes. And what's happening is that the vehicles and the instruments that are operating in this broad field of philanthropy has really undergone a very significant, explosive change. So what I want to do is try to explain, try to cover 6 points in the time that I have. I want to talk about what's happening, just descriptively what is going on. I want to say a word or two about why it's happening, and I think it's important to do that in order to make some judgment about whether this is going to survive or whether it's just a passing fad. We need to know where it came from, what its origins are. This is the answer to the question over here. Because if it's something that is trivial and we can't explain it, then we can't expect it to survive. Maybe we shouldn't even pay attention to it. Thirdly, I want to at least describe how I have attempted to make sense of this phenomenon. And that's really what this book is all about. It's an attempt to make sense of what is a very confusing array of actors and tools, and nobody knows what these words mean. You know, what can Avishkar International be? What are they doing? And so it's an attempt to sort out and make sense of this very important but very confusing phenomenon. Then fourthly, I want to talk about some of the obstacles that still remain. This is not a done deal. We are in an early stage still of this development, and so we need to understand the obstacles. And then fifthly, I want to talk about what the next steps therefore ought to be, and some of them I think I've already heard from our Futures Foundation. I think they're very foresighted in thinking through how to build this phenomenon into the future. And then I want to talk a little bit about what some of the implications are, particularly for foundations and maybe for schools like this one. So what's happening? I believe that underlying this explosion, there are four very fundamental processes of change going on. The first one is a movement beyond grants as the vehicle of philanthropy. Grants have been the historic vehicle, instrument, whatever word you want to use for it, through which philanthropy has operated. And when we look across other sectors, what quickly becomes apparent is that the other sectors have moved well beyond grants in their financial operations. Certainly the business community has. It's found loans, it's done bonds, it's done a whole host of financial tools that stretch the available resources. Governments around the world have done similarly. They use loan guarantees heavily, for example, tax subsidies. But old philanthropy is still stuck in the 19th century in terms of its tools of action. And what this is about, what this book is about, is the attempt to bring philanthropy from the 19th century, where it is still stuck, up until the 21st century. And to do that, we have to teach philanthropy that there are other tools that can be deployed in the world of social purpose activity. Secondly, we are moving beyond bequests as a vehicle for forming foundations. Foundations historically have come out of the wealth accumulated in the hands of private individuals who sometime in their life or after they die leave it to philanthropy. It takes a long time for that wealth to accumulate, and an even longer time to convince people who are making fortunes to turn it into philanthropic resources. But what has surfaced is other vehicles, other means of forming bequests, and you're going to hear one of those, which I've been working on, which I call philanthropication through privatization, capturing resources that are being transformed from government ownership or government control into private sector hands, in the course of which charitable foundations can be formed. And we've identified well over 550 major foundations around the world that have emerged from this philanthropication through privatization, involving many different types of assets. Government-owned businesses, yes, but also debt swaps, stolen assets, assets that come from some business that the government regulates and that keeps up a stream of revenue. So a whole new avenue of foundation apparatus. And privatization may be mostly over in this country, not fully by any means, but boy, is it ever raging in other parts of the world, including places like China, where I was last week. So that's the second development. Thirdly, we are moving well beyond foundations. There is a whole new world of institutions out there that have formed to channel financing, money, resources into charitable purposes, into social purposes. And foundations are at risk of kind of losing their place as the major vehicles for this transition process between people who are involved in social good and people who are financing it. And then fourthly, we're moving well beyond cash. We're in the sharing economy. We're in the world of vast increases of bartering. We're in a world of volunteering at an enormous scale. And so all of these things. So what's going on as a consequence of all this is a new paradigm of philanthropy. So all of these together add up to leverage. And I know leverage is not a word I've learned today, is not a word in Russia. It is essentially the process through which weak people like me can lift huge, heavy weights. Because we have found a way to get leverage. And we use a lever that gives us the power with a little bit of resources in either government or philanthropy to bring movement into the world of social purpose of the much larger resources in private investment capital. The private investment capital in the global economy is many, many times bigger than philanthropy and many, many times bigger than government. And it is the answer to some of these efforts to change the social and environmental landscape. So what's happening? So we can somewhat exaggeratedly contrast what I refer to as traditional philanthropy and the new frontiers of philanthropy. So traditional philanthropy focused on individuals and foundations. Those are the actors. They are the sources of the revenue. New frontiers of philanthropy is identifying multiple funds that come into the world of social purpose activities, and much of it mobilizing not charitable dollars, but private investment dollars. Traditional philanthropy focused on operating income. New frontiers of philanthropy focuses on investment capital. I wonder if anybody in the audience is this a difference that is understandable to people? I wonder if I can get a little participation. What is the difference between operating income and investment capital? We'll probably have problems with microphones, but does anybody know that distinction? Is it known in this country? Is it known? You have a What's the difference?
Есть доход и есть инвестиции.
She made the mistake of moving her head.
Операционный доход, так понимаю, доход, который получается в рамках своей деятельности.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat?
Операционный доход – это доход, который получает в рамках своей деятельности предприниматель.
And investment capital.
Инвестиционный капитал – то, что получает. Для кого? Для инвестора, тот, кто дает и зарабатывает на этом деньги. Правильно, на разнице? И либо тот, кто получает и платит за эти деньги. Смотри, какой ответ хотите вы получить. Да, со стороны инвестора, со стороны предпринимателя.
That's part of the answer. I would say that there's a bigger difference between these two. It's not the source of the money, it's what it's used for. Operating income is what you use in running your business in a particular year, or your organization in a particular year. But the business community knows that you can't only focus on what you are doing in a given year. You have to be thinking of the future. You have to be thinking of innovation. You have to be thinking of training. You have to do strategic planning. You have to buy equipment. You have to make investments in the facilities. These are all things that last more than a year. And if you only focus on keeping your organization going in a given year and don't invest into the future, you will eventually lose out and begin to decline. And investment capital is the resources that are building the future for your organization. And this is the capital, this is the type of income that has become now available through many of these new tools. It's not simply financing operating income. It is creating the vehicles that will produce operating income into the future, but for which you have to do planning, for which you have to do investment. And this new philanthropy is very much focused, for the first time, for social purpose organizations on capital and not simply on investment income. So it's a different notion. Traditional philanthropy, as I said, focuses on grants. New frontiers of philanthropy, many different financial instruments, and what are known as capital tranches, which I'll describe in a few minutes. Traditional philanthropy focused on nonprofits or non-commercial organizations. New philanthropy is focusing on a whole variety of new types of institutions that are delivering the resources. Some of them are social ventures or social enterprises. Some of them are social cooperatives. There are new forms of business corporations taking shape, so-called B Corps, business corps, or limited liability companies or limited profit companies. This is a new world of even the business structures. The traditional philanthropy focused exclusively on social return, and this is terrific. The new frontiers of philanthropy are opening another door and basically saying that we can pursue both social and financial return, and we can measure both. And this is a very significant development that allows somebody who's worried about financial return to achieve some degree of financial return, but also take advantage of the social return that also is available. Traditional philanthropy had limited leverage. You pay the money to the organization and it is gone. You hope that there's some social benefit, but frequently it wasn't even measured. The new frontiers of philanthropy is much more concerned about leverage, both the financial leverage and the social leverage that can come with it. And then finally, there's a tendency in traditional philanthropy to focus on outputs, how many children got schooling, how many houses were built, but not to focus as much on outcomes. What does this do in terms of equipping somebody to get a job or to live a healthy life? And it's much more focused on metrics. So we have this new ecosystem that is forming. The bottom, we hope, will remain the same beneficiaries. This is the great challenge of this whole idea. But they're new sources of funds. They're coming from high net worth individuals. They're coming from pension funds. They're coming from insurance companies. This is where the big private investment capital lives in our economies, much bigger than in charitable endowments. A whole new set of financial actors has surfaced to channel this money from these old sources into these social purpose activities. And that was what was on that first slide, showing the explosion of actors. There are now new tools that are being brought into the social investment field. And as you'll hear, they're not new tools to the world. Business has been using them, government has been using them. What's new is that they're being brought into the social purpose arena. And then there are new agents that are bringing them to work on the problems of the beneficiaries, solving poverty, providing low-cost eyeglasses, providing low-cost solar panels so that farmers in Africa can keep their food fresh without going bad before they get it to market. It's a whole new set of types of products. And then finally, the beneficiaries. So this is what's going on, and it's a really significant series of shifts. And so what we now have to do is ask the question, why is this happening now? I think there are lots of questions. I could spend a lot of time on it. Let me go through the basic arguments. Fundamentally, there's a set of demand factors, and then there's a set of supply factors that's going on. The demand factors are, I think, pretty well known. I refer to this as the new inferno. This is a book by a futurist named Lestera Brown, who analyzes environmental and other crises, and he lays out a scenario of 6 big crises, things like depletion of the water, over-farming and loss of the Earth's productivity, global warming, rapid population growth, failed states, growing poverty, and resulting radicalization and violence, a very gloomy view of what the world is facing, some of which we're experiencing. So that's been with us for a long time. We've always had these problems. A second thing that's happening is that governments and even charity are increasingly being tapped out. They are not growing at the rates they used to grow at, and in some cases are declining in real terms. Then a third factor, very important, is that we have seen this emergence of social entrepreneurs of the sort that Nasze budущее is trying to nurture here. And why that's significant is that when you have a bunch of demands that don't have any solutions, it's hard to get excited about it. But when people start coming to you with solutions of businesses that could be solutions to these problems, it creates a different demand situation. And that's what I think these social entrepreneurs have done. And then a growing need for capital. This has been a perennial issue for nonprofits. This is some data that we've done in the US, but the fundamental story is that nonprofit institutions generally are capital constrained. They have difficulty raising capital. One reason for that in many countries is that they can't distribute profits, therefore they can't sell shares. Who would buy shares in a company that can't give you a return? And so they're limited to bank financing, which tends to be much more expensive. So those are the demand factors. On the supply factors, there is also some very significant change. One of the most important is the second point here. New concepts have surfaced. And one of those important new concepts is the work of C.K. Prahalad and his book Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. Has anybody here heard of C.K. Prahalad's book? It should be required reading, I think, in any school of management these days. Nobody has heard of Prahalad? Prahalad is a Indian-born economist, taught at an American university, produced his book called Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. What did Prahalad say? He came up with a brilliant insight, which has really driven a lot of the social innovation that has been going on in social ventures. He said, listen, when you look at it, people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, the poor, are actually paying more for the things they need every day than people who are middle class and wealthy. Why is that? Well, they may only have one store for miles around. So the store can charge much higher for the products than if they were in a highly competitive city like Moscow, where there's a lot of competition. And so for soap, for deodorant, for things to wash their clothes, for all the things that you need to live, including food, they're actually paying more. And so if a smart entrepreneur can enter that market and find a way to market to the billions of people and accept, even a very small profit margin that's multiplied by the billions of people that live at the bottom of the pyramid, they can actually lower the cost and they can make a profit. And this is the answer to your question. And so he talks about the bottom of the pyramid penalty, that living at the bottom of the pyramid imposes a financial penalty, and a smart entrepreneur can do that. And we have lots of examples of that. So one of the ones that I mentioned before is the example of the entrepreneurs in India who noticed that children, particularly boys, were dropping out of school when they got to be about 8 years old, and nobody could figure out why this was happening. It turned out that they could not see the blackboard. They could not see the blackboard that they were being taught at. Why? They had poor eyesight. And they couldn't buy glasses because glasses cost $100, $200. So they invented, these entrepreneurs invented glasses that they could sell for $3 a pair. Enough for even poor people to be able to buy. But they figured that they would have 700 million people buying them, so they could make pennies on them and still end up with a profit. That's just one example, and there are dozens of examples of these entrepreneurs who are taking advantage of the penalty at the bottom of the pyramid. Then there's a whole set of new players, some of the wealthy individuals in this country and in other countries who've had the name philanthropic capitalists, people like Bill Gates. I think the financial crisis, at least in the West, had an impact on people's minds. They were sitting on these assets. Suddenly the assets looked like they were gone. And people began to say, why am I sitting on these assets? Why don't I get some personal benefit out of them? So they turned their minds a little bit towards this kind of social innovation and investment. So what I've tried to do in these two books is to get my arms around how to think about this stuff. So the books basically make a basic distinction between the new actors, which is how most of us are going to encounter this world. We're going to meet entities that are doing something, and we want to have a structure to put them into. And then, so there are 11 types of actors and 8 types of tools. So here are the 11 types of actors. I know that this will grow over time. And here are 8 types of tools. So let me, assuming we have still some time, who's keeping track of time?
Yeah, we'll still do it.
Okay, so let me just introduce you to some of these new actors and new tools. They have funny names for people in the social purpose arena. I'm sure that people in the management school here at Skolkovo will know them because they are very familiar in the financial world. So the first set are capital aggregators. These are entities that are amassing the funds that are now available for social purpose investments. They're available from high net worth individuals. They're increasingly available from investment houses, from investors who want to do something different, from pension funds, from banks. Some governments have created regulatory structures that encourage banks, for example, to invest in low-income housing. That's the case in the U.S. And what these capital aggregators do is they build investment tranches. Is that a word that translates at all into Russian? Do you want to take it?
We normally use the English language equivalent.
Okay, so a tranche is it's like a layer cake, different layers of funding. Why do they do this? They find that some investors have a requirement that they get a return that is equivalent to the risk that they undertake. And the appetite for return and the requirement for risk varies among different possible investors. So if you simply go to the investor with the highest return demand, you have to pay a very high price. But if you get somebody to come into the funding package that is willing to accept more risk and demand less return, then you can lower the total cost of that financing package. And this is the strategy behind building an investment tranche. And there are some funders who are able to do that. Obviously, foundations are, because typically you have high risk and you have zero return. So you're very, very attractive to somebody who's wanting to get into a tranche that is got a different risk and ratio of return. And this works, so they are building funds that have different investors with different combinations of risk and return expectation, and that allows them to offer that money at a much lower return than if the investor were simply to go, or the business were simply to go into the regular market. To give you an idea of how this works, let me just describe one case that will illustrate it. This is a U.S. case, so I apologize for that. This is going on in many other places as well. It happens to be one of our largest foundations, the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation was approached by a network of what in America are called charter schools. These are private, nonprofit organizations that create schools that people can choose to send their children to. And in these charter schools, the operating money is paid by the governments, the local governments. They're part of the local school system. But they have no money for the capital expenses. And so they've been doing their teaching in church basements and so forth. But at a certain point, they've grown to the point where they need buildings, they need equipment, and so they need capital. So they went to the Gates Foundation and they said, we need $300 million in a grant to build a network of 15 school buildings for our charter school network. And the Gates Foundation said, well, you know, we would love charter schools, very important, we'll look into it. And they decided to hire a consultant. And the consultant went to work and came back in about 3 or 4 months and said to the Gates Foundation, you would be crazy to make a grant. This is a business, it's a nonprofit, but it's a business, has a stable source of revenue, so it covers its operating costs, and it could pay back a low-cost loan or a bond, which is a big loan. Why don't you guarantee the bond issue? We figure that at worst, 10% of the bonds would go bad. So for $300 million of bonds, if you put on a $30 million guarantee, we think we could raise the money from the New York money markets. You would have to pay nothing. And so the Gates Foundation agreed to that. They did not spend one penny of their money. They didn't even have to move it from their existing investments. They simply had to write a legal document that said, we guarantee this loan. And then the charter schools issued a bond issue. And it was sold, began to be sold on the New York money markets. Instead of paying 8% interest, they were able to pay 4 or 5% interest, which made it feasible for them. So here's a brilliant example of a funding tranche with a guarantee at the bottom and money coming from pension funds and from investment funds, lowering the overall interest. So this is what capital aggregators do. We have identified about 3,000 of these capital aggregators around the world, with at least $300 billion of capital sitting in these existing funds. Another example, secondary markets. They are similar. Is this a term that is familiar? Secondary markets. Secondary markets obviously exist in the commercial field. They basically function to refresh the lenders who make primary loans. You may have a bank that makes loans to individuals to buy homes. Once they use up their lending resources, they can't make any loans unless they can sell the loans to somebody. And the secondary markets are the ones who buy the loans, and they get their money from the big capital markets, from pension funds, from insurance companies. We've always had this in the finance arena. In the US, we had some difficulties in 2009 with these secondary markets. You may have heard of AIG. But we have now seen the emergence of secondary markets in the social purpose arena. To give you an example, there's one called Habitat for Humanity. This is a large nonprofit that builds housing for poor people. It uses volunteers entirely. Jimmy Carter, one of our former presidents, has been very active in Habitat for Humanity. Habitat for Humanity has local organizations that are affiliates of it all over the world. They get the labor for free, but of course they have to buy the land, they have to buy the equipment, they have to buy the materials to pay to build the houses. So they have developed a loan program, but the local affiliates quickly run out of that loan money. And so Habitat for Humanity has created a secondary market. It's called the, forget what the name of it is, but it's a Habitat for Humanity secondary market note. And they have gathered money from high net worth individuals, from various financial institutions, and they buy the mortgages from their affiliates. The mortgages, of course, have interest coming in, and thereby they give new money to the affiliates. So that's secondary markets. The BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Action Committee, just recently created a $180 million secondary market loan program for microfinance institutions. So we're talking about significant funds here. A third example are social stock exchanges. One of the difficulties in this field is linking the investor with the social enterprise. If you have to go out and find an investor, there's a high transaction cost. One way to solve that is to create a stock exchange where you don't have to actually meet, the investor doesn't have to meet the social enterprise and vice versa. So it has great power. It obviously requires very significant regulatory provisions and transparency. And so there are a couple of social stock exchanges that have surfaced around the world. One of the most well-developed is in Singapore. It's called the IXX Stock Exchange, a very significant breakthrough as well. So these are some of the environmental stock exchanges. The carbon credit markets are other examples of the same thing. Foundations as philanthropic banks. This is this phenomenon I mentioned before of foundations that are beginning to use new tools. What they're doing is breaking down what has long been considered a Chinese wall between the investment side of foundations and the program side. Foundations have significant endowments. They're managed by investors in the pay of the foundation. Very little historic relationship between the investors and the program side. So you may have a foundation interested in protecting the environment with its programs, investing in, I don't know, coal companies that are hurting the environment. In other words, undoing with their investments what they're trying to do with their programs. So one of the steps is to break that down and to make sure that the investments are consistent with the programs. A second thing they do is to tap their asset base for their mission. So not only their grants budget, which comes out in the US, only 5% of the assets go into the programs, into the grants. So 95% are left in the investments. What's happening is the foundations are beginning to utilize some of these new tools using their foundation assets, making loans, making loan guarantees. They're using alternative tools, and they're going beyond what in the US are called program-related investments. I won't get into that. It's a US phenomenon, but basically a way to put grant money into businesses and not simply into foundations. So these are examples. If I can just name one other example, this is this phenomenon of conversion foundations. This is what I mentioned before, this philanthropication through privatization. We've identified 559 cases of foundations that have come out of some type of privatization transaction, about 155 billion US dollars, spread pretty far around the world. And these are huge foundations. The Volkswagen Foundation in Germany is an example, or these Italian foundations of banking origin. They're huge institutions that have come out of the privatization of some asset that has either been owned by the government or controlled by the government. So Volkswagen came out of the sale of the Volkswagen company. It was a government-owned company. 60% of the proceeds went into a foundation for German science. Other cases are more complicated. The King Baudouin Foundation in Belgium, it gets about 30% of its grant budget from a national lottery, and that money comes to it automatically. It's a law that says it should be paid into that foundation on a regular basis. In other words, it functions as if it were an endowment, because what is an endowment? It's an asset that produces a stream of revenue, and this is the stream of revenue coming out of the business. You take that idea of that lottery kind of payment, you take it to Africa and ask yourself, is there any asset in Africa, a country with almost no foundations, is there any asset there that is kicking up a stream of revenue that could be tapped for social purposes, much like a foundation? And what quickly becomes apparent is that the answer is yes, absolutely. Africa is rich in natural resources, minerals, oil, gold, that's being pulled out of the ground, some of it by companies probably owned in this country. Those companies pay money to the government. They are very unhappy with that arrangement because they are causing environmental damage in local communities. The local communities are getting none of that money. They are protesting against the mining operations. So here are the companies paying money and then having local communities protest. And they would find very attractive the idea of having some of that money channeled into charitable endowments. And so we're working with the International Council of Mining and Minerals to get that idea explored. Are we running out of time?
No, can we make a little stop here? Because so far you've done a very good overview of new sources of financing as well as infrastructure. So we've been talking about various infrastructural solutions and wealth, sort of top-down approach. If we try to do a little simulation, bottom-up view, Gor, you have various funds and projects supported by your Друзья fund. If we take one of your projects and try to think about one of the instruments mentioned by Professor Salomon, can we try and combine these new innovative financial instruments and apply them to your projects?
Sure.
Most of them currently are pure charitable giving.
Are we going to speak
models.
English with translation? By the way, in your case, you bring a lot of interesting examples, but may I ask you, is it any examples of bankruptcy of this organization?
Of what?
Bankruptcy. Bankrupt.
Of course.
Yeah. Because мы очень, если мы переводим наш язык на такой бизнесовый язык, то хотелось бы посмотреть не только на успешные проекты, но и на проекты банкрота, то есть или спящие банкроты. Соответственно, в нашей деятельности мы еще находимся, так сказать, и в управлении. Только один фонд, может, два фонда, которые находятся в состоянии, в котором уже можно говорить о подобных инструментах. То есть один из них это кредитование или просто выпуск бандов, облигаций, с помощью которых можно финансировать длинные программы фонда, потому что уже есть трек-рекорд 10-летний по фандрейзингу, уже можно понимать, что они могут с помощью фандрейзинга закрыть долги. Допустим, строительство реабилитационного центра фонда «Подари жизнь», где в эндаумент в дар от правительства Москва перешла старинная усадьба с большим количеством земли. То есть это уже есть актив, которым можно закладывать, брать кредиты, достраивать это здание и, соответственно, работать не столько как благотворительный фонд, а как такая прогрессивная компания, инвестор в real estate, да, то есть уже используя все инструменты бизнеса.
Lester, will cash flow projection?
She wants you to use the mic.
Let's take this example. You have an investor looking at a cash flow projection, and the source of incoming money is fundraising. I don't think it would suffice as only one source of money.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think, I guess I got this one. You know, one of the big issues that I would get to towards the end is this issue of deal flow.
Mm-hmm.
Are there deals out there, enough deals out there, that when investors look at it, provide that kind of viability? And so that the growth of this market is inhibited by the slowness of development of the actual deals. So there are very vigorous assessments done of the proposals, but it's happening, you know, and it's growing. So you know, both things are happening. What has to happen is that investors have to come to see this as a market. The returns so far have been quite good, particularly in a world in which government bonds are paying 1% or 2%. They're doing much better, and there's a lot of data now.
Or even negative.
And sometimes negative in real terms, yeah. So if you can come to an investor with 3%, 4% return on something that also has a social value, it's a very attractive deal. So the data that has been generated, this is a report that's done every year by J.P. Morgan Social Finance in London, shows quite interesting, quite impressive return rates on the outstanding capital, and the capital is growing, but it's not growing at a rate that would make you think that it's arrived as a major asset class. It's you know, there are probably at least $300 billion in these loan funds or equity funds. The money under management is probably on the order of $70 billion around the world. So it's not as large as the insurance industry of the world, but it has been growing. The number of investors has been growing, and the funds have been growing.
And
the
there
return
are
rates,
target projects.
I'm sorry?
And there are target companies and projects underlying this infrastructure.
Absolutely, right. Both the providers of the capital aggregators, and the other financial instruments, but also the underlying this. I mean, I'm looking at the supply side of the market. There is a demand side of the market, and one of the limitations of the whole field is the demand side of the market is not growing as robustly as the supply side, which is an unusual kind of situation, but it argues for getting the social entrepreneurs equipped with the knowledge of these tools and the business ideas that can generate this kind of development. And there are fields in which that is very close to happening. I would say that microfinance, which is one of the tools that's emerged, changing micro businesses into micro financial services, so from microfinance to micro financial services. It's another huge arena in which there is a gigantic market. Cell phone companies is another whole arena. So there are places where the opportunities for this are promising, but it's a slow grind to get the actual entrepreneurs and the actual investors together.
Наталья Ивановна, среди ваших подопечных, наверное, большее число компаний и проектов, которые могут воспользоваться этим инструментарием, потому что они все-таки бизнесы, коммерческие проекты. какой-то социальной компонентой?
На самом деле мы тоже выдаем займы, правда, беспроцентные, что позволяет встать на ноги социальным предпринимателям. И, собственно говоря, вот эта вот, наверное, ставка льготная, она и позволяет им вот выжить на первом этапе. Если бы они воспользовались займами микрофинансовых организаций, но они просто не смогли бы выжить, потому что там огромные ставки. Вот. А банки им не дают, поэтому вот здесь надо какие-то новые инструменты, да, вот о которых Соломон здесь рассказывал, пытаться внедрять, привлекать социальных инвесторов, возможно, работать с законодательством и предоставить льготы как раз для инвесторов, да, возможно, там 1% НДФЛ их будет мотивировать вкладывать в социальные инвестиции, социальные бизнесы. Вот. То есть какие-то нужны действительно финансовые преференции для того, чтобы развивались и социальные предприниматели, и формировался класс социальных инвесторов.
Лестер, а вот в этой связи, возможно, ну, в России пока развиваются только эти инструменты, да, вот фонд «Наше будущее» — это такой пионер продвижения новых инструментов филантропических. Возможно, превращение российского социального предпринимателя в международного позволит получить доступ к тем инструментам, которые уже активно используются в других странах. Вот я знаю, что фондом «Наше будущее» была разработана собственная система сертификации, уже были сертифицированы 3 десятка социальных предпринимателей. Вы уже упоминали B Corps, российские предприниматели там не зарегистрированы. Как вы думаете, могут ли российские социальные предприниматели претендовать на международную сертификацию, и, может быть, это поможет им с точки зрения использования вот тех инструментов, которые уже есть в мире?
Absolutely. I think that a lot of the money, there's a very big difference between where the money originates and where the money ends up. 70%, well, about 80% of the resources coming into this field are in advanced developed Western countries. 70% of the investments are in emerging markets. So there's no reason why Russian entrepreneurs couldn't tap into those resources. And having some kind of certification is, I think, an advantage. So what I guess you should take out of this presentation is that something real is happening out there, and how to connect Russian social enterprises to it, becomes, I think, the next obvious question. How first to foster Russian social entrepreneurs, and then how to connect them to these pools of funds becomes important. And so the whole point of this book is to, let me just jump to the end and say what I think is needed. So there's a very important task, I think, of just visualization. Having people just visualize what is going on out there. And you may decide that it's not for you, but if you don't have any sense of it, you may miss an important opportunity. So this book was an attempt to, particularly the introduction, which you have now nicely translated. It's a great visualization tool, but of course visualization can't rely on a book. You have to go out and talk about it, which is why I'm pleased to be here. And then there's this second process of publicizing it and making sure that it does get out after you've visualized it. Very important phenomenon that is important to this field and gets underappreciated is the one that you just mentioned about how to incentivize it. And I can tell you that in both the US and the UK, where this has grown significantly, it's been very important that there has been government policy that has incentivized it. Just to speak of the US, we have something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which is a tax credit for investment in low-income housing that goes to the investor, to insurance companies, to other holders of investment funding. We have something called the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires banks to put money back into the communities from which they get their deposits. including particularly low-income communities. We have something called the New Markets Tax Credit. We have a network of government-sanctioned community development finance institutions. It's a pretty elaborate structure of incentives to encourage the mobilization of private investment capital. So we shouldn't think that this is all going to happen magically. It is going to require incentivization. The incentives can really only come from two sources, government or foundations. The foundations have been slow to get into it, but are beginning to. But government has been important. So incentivizing it. And I didn't get into, but there's a whole strategy connected with this term social impact bonds, which is a strategy that involves getting investors to make preventive investments in programs that will ultimately save government money. So that you can come to government with a bundle that basically says, listen, we can save you a certain amount of money. For example, we can lower the prison population by helping people get jobs and improve their lives, saving enormous amounts of money. It's going to require a certain amount of preventive investment. The investors will be willing to make this investment if you will pay back the investment. And typically the savings to government is many, many times greater than the cost of the prevention. The governments don't do very well at preventing problems. So this is a way to sell this idea to governments and get them to ultimately pay for really effective programs that reduce the cost to government. This can happen in many different fields. And then there's this fourth thing that is necessary, which is to develop the capacity of the social entrepreneurs to approach investors with this kind of package. And that's a big training challenge for everybody. And then, of course, there's the creation of the deals. So I think that it's possible to connect the Russian social enterprise community to the foreign international funders. They are eager for finding investable propositions. It's one of the big impediments. They're not getting enough of them. Their doors are open. They've got money sitting waiting to be utilized. And if you have a way to pre-screen them and basically say that they look like they're promising opportunities, I think there are investors out there that would happily put resources into it.
Thank you, Lester. I'm terribly sorry. We're a little out of time, and as a moderator, I have to keep the track of going onto the coffee break on time. But still, if we still have one